to me and said, "I understand why they have a meth problem. There's nothing to do with the state."
That I do not at all have a surprise with.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but it was an oddly logical statement. Oh, hey, speaking of statements, Brits, do you still have that
Hmm.
software to like make a banner for the for like a reading or whatever?
I'm changing the software I'm using for that, but yeah, generally.
You shoot me a link. Like we did a Kafka thing. I'd like to submit that to you.
It's a new thing now. The
Oh man,
Yeah, I know. So the way we're
oh, you
setting
gotta
up,
change the rules on me, dude.
well, it's because so that system was Adobe. I was using Adobe Express for that. Um,
Oh,
and
okay.
Adobe Express changed its rights pattern so that way everyone who uses Adobe Express now everything that you use on it, they have the rights to reproduce and use in their AI system. And that's a big fucking no for me. It's a big fucking no for me. So
It's a no. It's a no Dobie.
it's a no-be.
Nobi. A Nobi one.
What the fuck is wrong with my stream setup?
So do we have a new hope in lieu of that, or
So instead, I'm having to basically do a lot of it a little bit more manually. So it's a long story. I'll tell you afterwards. We'll walk through it.
okay?
But I don't know. We've got a lot of AO to get through today. At least I think we do. I'm
You're still doing
hoping.
that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just trying to get the make sure that the YouTube stream is recording for the recording, because this stupid fucking program is like, no, you're not connected, but it looks like I'm connected. Things are live. All right, excellent. Uh, excellent. Well, thank you for letting me know that. All right. So since I am live, we'll go ahead and kick off and get into Anti-Oedipus, because this is going to be a lot. Actually, this is going to be a lot. Fuck. There's so much in here. I had us at the middle of 233. My question was, do we want to go back to 232? Am I in the right spot? Jack?
Sorry, buddy. The mute button was far away. Let me review this real quick. 'Cause my bookmark was further back than that.
Hmm. Have we not gotten that far? Things blur together too much for me.
I don't think we did, Brooks. I think we're.
Then it's 228,
I think we're 230.
30.
Yeah, that's where I have my marker too.
Okay.
Yeah, let us return.
That works for me.
JK, let us return.
Yeah, that's where I have my marker also on 230.
All right. Then that's
Okay.
where we'll go. Easy enough. Well then, excellent. So I'll go ahead and kick us off, and we'll just dive in and make our way through. Hello, everyone. Oh, I need to get Craigbot in here. That's my fault. Get Craigbot in.
Can we use Alistair?
Now recording.
I usually use Alistair.
Equal opportunity, you know.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And Ben's joined. Excellent. All right. So, hello. Welcome to the Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are interminably making our way through 3.9. This is going to take a little bit. I kind of don't even know how to bring us up to speed exactly where we're at, because there is a huge amount that has been said so far. We're going to end up doing a big, gigantic sort of retreading of all of this in a probably two-part retrospective of the entire thing, but we'll see what we can go ahead and do with that. For now, however, All right. For now, we are in the middle of 2:30. The stuff that matters to kind of bring us up to pace is the discussion we're making on how desire and money specifically interact, how capital operates, how money and capital are not the same thing. There's a bunch of different stuff that sort of goes into this as we make our way through. Does anyone want to try to take a crack at summing up where we're at or bringing us a bit forward? All right. Well, then I'll do it the best I can because it's just a huge amount. It's a huge amount of shit. When we talk
I'll
about,
take a crack at it.
oh, thank God, because I've been rereading this and trying to figure out how to summarize. So I will let you go for it.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. Yeah, so I mean, basically, like what they're going over at this point in the book, right, at the beginning of 3.9, they're talking about how we move from the despotic to capital, and basically, right, the point there is that capitalism is not born through a labor market, right? So it's not because people can sell their labor and people can buy that labor that capitalism or capital becomes socius, right? It is based on industrial capital's emergence for Deleuze and Guattari. And basically that's a question for them of moving from a disjunct as the primary synthesis in the despotic to the conjunct in capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point in the book, the way they're explaining that is to basically, as usual, talk about how the disjunct is changing. So you're moving from the tension between the filiative and the alliant, and the extended filiation, the new alliance, to something new, right? Which is basically um, one, it's derivative, and two, it's this question of d of x and d of y, right? Where the filiative and the alliant respectively emerge through fixed and variable capital. Yeah, I do have that consistent. And that's basically it, right? They're introducing decoding into recoding and coding.
Yeah. The big play specifically is understanding the difference between, as you said, or as he talks about, he uses Marx a lot in this, constant or industrial capital. Constant capital being the just cost of things. And there's a bit of exchangeism inside of that. But the other side of it being the nature of variable capital, the way that basically we can depress labor. I was watching a thing earlier. There's a big new push in fast food right now to get prices back down. I don't know if you've seen this, because if you haven't bought from McDonald's lately, a 2 cheeseburger meal is $13.50 after taxes. A quarter pounder meal is like $16 now. Like, it's kind of crazy. When I was younger, I remember everything being $5. The thing that's happened, though, a lot of this is due to just them. The inflation is real to a point, but a lot of this has just been price gouging for the last 2 to 3 years. A lot of studies have shown this. So what they're doing instead is they're starting to cut back and have value meals for a limited time. Now, how do they do this? Well, there's kind of the reality of what it means to be sort of part of a supply chain now. There's just the cost of stuff, how much meat costs, how much buns cost, how much a building costs, how much fryers cost, how much peanut oil costs for deep frying, how much grills cost. Like the capital that it takes to just have the building and fill it with the stuff that is needed to make things, with the exception of people. But each one of those things that needs to fill it is also made by people elsewhere. And so what you find in this sort of large chain of things is that you have a combination, not just of a general exchangeism. This is mercantilism that has been around for thousands of years. This is boring. But instead, the way that capital operates by basically utilizing that variable capital, the amount we pay people within that supply chain, to depress wages, to push down wages, to change how much anyone gets paid at various places, so you can save money and make the entire process more efficient. This shift puts us in a place where capital finally emerges. And specifically, it's where the dy dx shows up, or as they say, the filiative form of capital, x plus the derivative of x. The rate of change of profit plus capital that was put into it. Here is where we see the first time that money makes money. Capital makes capital. And this is a big change. This is where you find investment capital as a thing. This is where you find bank loans as a thing, where money makes money. Money didn't make money under the kings, under the despots, under anything else. Money was used as a medium of exchange that the despot would have control over. So this shift, this trade that is happening is the form of capital now, this abstraction of labor that's able to be transferred and moved around inside of this other sort of disembodied thing, as they call it, the vampire, the way that capital operates. So this dualism of money is where we sort of take off today. And I think that's a great way to go. If you didn't join us during our sort of revisiting on Friday, I'll let you talk real quick, Jack. I just want to say Suzanne de Brunoff. Read her book, Marks on Money. There's basically nothing else that will help you understand this better. And I'm currently rereading it so that way I can explain this better because it's that good of a book. Go for it, Jack.
Yeah, I don't have anything to offer to Brunoff, but if before we jump in, we could just hop back to something on 228.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, again, the critical thing is to understand right now how the disjunction is changing, right? That's the real through line in understanding this transition. Well, we'll call it transformation, so I don't over linearize it. So this is 228. So I'm going to read a grace note and then I'll go into the part I'm interested in. Industrial capital thus offers a new filiation that is a constituent part of the capitalist machine, in relation to which commercial capital and financial capital will now take the form of a new alliance by assuming specific functions. So industrial capital now acts as your new filiation. So it's your filiative line, right?
Yep.
Commercial and financial capital are now the new alliance, right? So now for the part I'm more interested in. In the one case, there are impotent money signs of exchange value, a flow of means of payment relative to consumer goods and use values, and a one-to-one relation between money and an imposed range of products. So I mean, generally speaking, right, we're talking about the filiative there. So, I mean, very basically, right, when we talk about the filiative here, at a very basic level, we're talking about something like value form D in Marx, which is basically money in relation to commodities, right? At just a very general basic level. In the other case, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. Keep
In
going.
the other case, signs of the power of capital, flows of financing, a system of differentiated quotients of production that bear witness to a prospective force or to a long-term evaluation, non-realizable hic et nunc, and functioning as an axiomatic of abstract quantities. So if we break this down, right, this is where we're talking about how alliance works, right? How capital uses itself in terms of commercial and financial capital. So first we have signs of the power of capital, right? So notice the difference in the semiotics. One is impotent, one is potent. Flows of financing. So we're talking about, lending money and things like that, right? Instruments of finance. A system of differential quotients of production. So, again, with ratios, right? A quotient is an answer to a division problem. So we're talking about ratios in production. And all this is to bear witness to prospective force or to a long-term evaluation, right? So there's two sides to this, right? The potential, because this is potent signs, right? The potential that financing commercial capital make possible, but also that they do make possible at a long-term level, right? In terms of scheduling. Functioning as an axiomatic of abstract quantities, and that's to dovetail this into where we're going like right now and everything, right? This is where you start to get that relationship between quotients and axioms, where you start talking about how the ratio depends on a kind of it's not a principle, but a kind something like that, right? And that's all to talk about how alliance now functions, which is the real that's the real trick of that last part, right?
Hmm.
Financing capital, commercial capital. It's all discussions of alliance, right? It's all horizontal.
The thing when we're talking about this, and it's calculus is going to get really annoying here. Deleuze utilizes calc in an extraordinary number of his texts. It's important to have, I would say, a baseline understanding of these things to really grasp some parts of what he's talking about. Here specifically, though, we can break it down in a way I think that anyone who lives in a capitalist society, probably anyone who's hearing the sound of my voice, can actually grasp very simply the more complex when we say, it's the dy over dx setup, and we're talking about when we're talking about any of this, the economic term for this is actually going to be called marginal product. So the way that economists talk about this, because all of this is actually a thing that businesses give a shit about. Deleuze isn't making this out of whole cloth. If you have a business, you have a certain amount of things that go into the business, your intake. And that can be money. Generally, it isn't. It can be people and product. Generally, it's those two things. You have stuff that comes in. You have costs that for those things, but you have stuff that comes in. And you have people that do the work for you. The dy over dx specifically has to do with how you make any single unit change in that input. So if you have to think about these things very coldly to get to this point, but this is the way that people talk about these things. When we have a change in input factor, you have another person that you've hired, or you have a new supplier, or you have a new product that comes in, or a new product going part of the production. What ultimately happens is that you find a derivative in change. This is your marginal product, your as he calls it here, I think, the differential quotient of production that bears witness to a prospective force or to a long-term evaluation, not realizable here and now, functioning as an axiomatic of abstract quantities. This is, hey, I'm going to hire Steve to work on a thing. Or, hey, I've got a new supplier coming in. He's bringing me, I don't know, tungsten instead of iron. What the fuck? I play too many video games. Whatever it is, this is what's the prospective force or a long-term evaluation that is not realizable here and now. This is the power of capital that is sort of playing out here. So when you're talking about how the rate of change fluctuates and the fluxion of that rate of change, it's a huge deal within the capitalist economy. If you can hit multiples, and you will, I can give you examples if you would like, but if you can hit multiples, it's a big, huge win. You'll get a fuck ton of money and investment in order to keep doing that. But here's the challenge, because it's a mathematical law of diminishing returns. The more of any input that you add to a fixed amount of number of other inputs, the marginal product of that input will eventually decrease. It's the nature of profit. It's the nature of business, the nature of capital. This is this tendency to a falling rate of profit that he talks through here and connects it to the law of diminishing returns pretty much directly, which it is. I mean, it is. So he's bringing these things back around to real basic mathematical principles, but saying this conjunction that we're now talking about within capital, this dy over dx, this is where the shit really changes and where we start to see, as he says here, the functioning of an axiomatic of abstract quantities. This push is where we're going to be making our move today, actually. So I'm going to get to our reading now, and we will do what we can to make it through everything, I guess. Off we go. Let us return to the dualism of money, to the two boards, the two inscriptions, the one going into the account of the wage earner, the other into the balance sheet of the enterprise. Measuring the two orders of magnitude in terms of the same analytical unit is a pure fiction. I'm 99% sure we read this, guys. Just mentioning. There is no common measure between the value of the enterprises and that of the labor capacity of wage earners. That is why the falling tendency has no conclusion. A quotient of differentials is indeed calculable if it is a matter of the limit of variation of the production of flux from the viewpoint of a full output, but it is not calculable if it is a matter of the production flux and the labor flux on which surplus value depends. Thus, the difference is not cancelled in the relationship that constitutes it as a different nature. The tendency has no end. It has no exterior limit that it could reach or even approximate. The tendency's only limit is internal, and it is continually going beyond it, but being displaced. But by displacing this limit, that is, reconstituting it, by rediscovering it as an internal limit to be surpassed again by means of a displacement. Thus, the continuity of the capitalist process engenders itself in this break of a break that is always displaced, this unity of the schiz and the flow. In this respect, already the field of social immanence, as revealed under the withdrawal and the transformation of the Urstadt, is continually expanding and acquires a consistency entirely its own, which shows the manner in which capitalism, for its part, was able to interpret the general principle according to which things work well, only providing they break down. Crises being the means imminent to the capitalist mode of production. If capitalism is the interior limit of all societies, this is because capitalism, for its part, has no exterior limit, but only an interior limit, that is capital itself, and that does not encounter but reproduces by always displacing it. Jean-Joseph Gueux rigorously analyzes the mathematical phenomenon of the curve without a tangent, the direction it is apt to take in economy as well as linguistics. Quote, if the movement does not tend toward a limit, if the quotient of differentials is not calculable, the present no longer has meaning. The quotient of differentials is not resolved, the differences no longer cancel one another in their relationship. No limit opposes the break or the breaking of this break. The tendency finds no end. The thing in motion never quite reaches what the immediate future has in store for it. It is endlessly delayed by accidents and deviations. Such is the complex notion of a continuity within the absolute break. In the expanded immanence of the system, the limit tends to reconstitute in its displacement the thing it tended to diminish in its primitive emplacement. We totally read all this, by the way, guys. So I'll make a fast pass as we go through this. Again, they're explaining and going through sort of the genealogy of some arguments they're going to be going through sort of a lot of different steps as they sort of work to sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say abruptly, I don't want to sort of jump ahead too fast, but they're talking through sort of the nature of how the dualism of money has very particular movements it does. Now, one of those, and specifically here, is the curve without a tangent, this really odd thing that happens in some specific mathematical situations where there really isn't a limit to a curve. It never quite reaches that limit. Calculus, you could say, is actually a mathematics of limits, of approaches, approaching numbers, approaching limits. And there's this really strange thing that happens with very specific curves that they don't quite get there. They get really, really, really close, but they never have that sort of moment of connecting, of making it to the point that they need. Capitalism has this very same play for the same reason, with the same dy dx differential, because always we have capitalism show up, it industrializes, we get some new technia, some new machines that are able to push things forward, yet somehow that new limit is reconstituted inside of those machines, which brings us again to the point of, okay, well, now that we have the falling rate of profit rejoining us and we kind of return back to this place of the average product, now we need to do it again, and a new machine shows up, which causes the old ones to become old hat, and for us to surpass those machines. And off we go. But we never move forward. We haven't moved forward. Capitalism hasn't allowed us to move forward, not at large, not in any meaningful sense. We're still doing the same stuff. We're still working the same type of work. We're still enslaved by the system, you might say. The step hasn't made that sort of next play. So it's a really interesting sort of, it's a specifically calculus-based argument for us to take a look at the entire thing.
So I don't know if it's about making a new step though, right? Like,
well, I mean, it kind of is, but the problem is that it's not, maybe you're right, it's a phrasing thing. It's not that it makes the new step. It's that the limit that it's pushing, that it seems to be pushing, or that next step would be pushing, seems to be going, oh, we're going to get to that thing, but then it turns out to just reconstitute this internal limit inside of the thing. So we never actually make the step forward that we are intending to, if that makes sense.
I'd like to pick that apart a little bit more.
Please.
So, okay. A quotient of differentials is indeed calculable if it is a matter of the limit of variation of the production flows from the viewpoint of full output, but it is not calculable if it is a matter of the production flow and the labor flow on which surplus value depends. Okay, so what we're talking about in this paragraph is basically where it's spanning the argument on affiliative and alliant capital, right? The two inscriptions, one goes into the account of the wage earner, the other into the balance sheet of the enterprise. Interestingly enough, that sounds to me like we're talking about the affiliative and the alliant respectively. So limit of variation production from the viewpoint of a full output. So the limit of the output is calculable, but the limit of surplus value is not calculable, right? So notice what's being said there. The affiliative has a limit, the alliant does not, if I'm reading this correctly. Or we might say, perhaps in looking at it a different way, we can wonder if codification has a limit here in terms of impotence, but decodification does not. Different way of thinking about it, perhaps, but the difference is not canceled in the relationship that constituted as a difference in nature. The so-called tendency has no end. It has no exterior limit that it could reach or even approximate. So, I mean, again, the limit would be where either output ceases or surplus value ceases, right? So when we're talking about the limit, we're talking about, like, in a sense, a point at which surplus value would no longer change and would perhaps, kind of conclude, as opposed to output, right? The tendency's
Yes.
only limit is internal,
Correct.
and it is continually going beyond it. So it's constantly going beyond the limit of the internal, but by displacing this limit, that is, by reconstituting it. It's like we've seen this term before, right? This is part of the fourth paralogism, if I remember correctly, displacement. So it's got a Freudian sense as much as a mathematical sense. And by reconstituting it, right, it's a movement. By rediscovering as an internal limit to be surpassed again by means of a displacement. So to me, this sounds like the limit for the production of surplus value, right, is constantly being changed, or insofar as it is being approached, it is moved. Thus, the continuity of the capitalist process engenders itself, and this break of a break, so we're talking about the binary law, that is always displaced in this unity of the schism flow. So we're talking about the group being reconstituted in tandem with the limit. In this respect already, the field of social immanence as revealed under the withdrawal transformation of the Erstat is continually expanding. So notice what's being said, right? The displacement of the limit doesn't shrink production, it expands production. So there's a paradox here, right? I would expect this to be a shrinking argument since we're dealing with limits, right? Or at least no new ground gained. On the contrary, we have expansion and acquires a consistency entirely its own, which sounds like the filiative, which shows the manner in which capitalism, for its part, was able to interpret the general principle according to which things work well only providing they break down, crises being the means imminent to the capitalist mode of production. So, right, like in that sense, recessions, for instance, economic breaks, not only are they functional, right, but they're a way of capital displacing its own limit. So it's a way of changing how surplus value is produced. It's a way of the disjunction being altered effectively.
Well, and
Capitalism.
it's also placing it as the center of things. Like that's because we're talking about the shift between essentially coding, overcoding, and now surplus value of flux, the axiomatization as we're going to be calling it. But like this is the thing, the quantitative difference between the flux of money and within various factors of production, the reduction of labor to such an input. This conjunction of things is the center of the capitalist production because it happens again on capital. Right? Am I right?
Well, whether or not there's a reduction of labor, right? What's changing is value form D. So money in relation to commodities, which they're putting in terms of a wage earner, right? And on the other, which is your filiative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, they're changing how I would say very broadly financing works. Right? Financing being your alliance. And that's
Correct.
a very broad way of dealing with it, but it's simple for right now.
Yeah,
So
it's because
in that
we
sense,
went through this because when we're
in
talking,
in in,
sorry, go ahead.
in that in that sense, I think it's the internal limit, right, rather than the centricity of it. Go ahead.
I'd have to think about that one for a minute. Probably too long. Any questions before we move on to actually where we left off last week? Yeah, I actually think we're almost, I think we're there because this is the section on deterritorialization, which is good, finally getting there. Okay, I'm going to assume that that's pretty decent. But no one's got a thing. I'm going to jump forward. All right. We'll continue on page 231. Now the movement of displacement. For those of you following along. Here, let me actually share my screen because I just realized I'm not doing that in the setup here. Let's get this boop boop there. All right. Now, this movement of displacement belongs essentially to the deterritorialization of capitalism. Be ready for this word a lot from here out. As Samir Amin has shown, the process of deterritorialization here goes from the center to the periphery, that is, from the developed countries to the underdeveloped countries, which do not constitute a separate world, but rather an essential component of the worldwide capitalist machine. It must be added, however, that the center itself has its organized enclaves of underdevelopment, its reservations, and its ghettos as interior peripheries. Pierre Moussa has defined the United States as a fragment of the Third World that has succeeded and has preserved its immense zones of underdevelopment. And if it is true that the tendency to a falling rate of profit or to its equalization asserts itself at least partially at the center, carrying the economy toward the most progressive and most automated sectors, A veritable development of underdevelopment on the periphery ensures a rise in the rate of surplus value in the form of an increasing exploitation of the peripheral proletariat in relation to that of the center. For it would be a great error to think that exports from the periphery originate primarily in traditional sectors or archaic territorialities. On the contrary, they come from modern industries and plantations that generate an immense surplus value, to a point where it is no longer the developed countries that supply the underdeveloped countries with capital, but quite the opposite. So true is it that primitive accumulation is not produced just once at the dawn of capitalism, but is continually reproducing itself. Capitalism exports filiative capital. At the same time as capitalist deterritorialization is developing from the center to the periphery, the decoding of flux on the periphery develops by means of a disarticulation that ensures the ruin of traditional sectors, the development of extroverted economic circuits, a specific hypertrophy of the tertiary sector, and an extreme inequality in the different areas of productivity and in incomes. Each passage of a flux is a deterritorialization, and each displaced limit a decoding. Capitalism schizophrenizes more and more on the periphery. It will be said that even so, at the center, the falling tendency retains its restricted sense, i.e., the relative diminution of surplus value in relation to total capital, a diminution that is ensured by the development of productivity, automation, and constant capital. I could go super deep into how this is about the exploitation and setup of third worlds, of the secondary parts of the world, the tertiary peripheral of where American capital or the capitalist system sits. I tend to presume I'm speaking mostly to the choir here. One of the things that's the important line to talk about is the idea that filiative capital, capital that makes capital, is exported from the center to the periphery. But that they have this line here, specifically, it'd be great error to think that exports from the periphery originate primarily in traditional sectors or archaic territorialities. On contrary, they come from modern industries and plantations that generate an immense surplus value, to a point where it is no longer the developed countries that supply the underdeveloped countries with capital, but quite the opposite. Specific phrasing here. We tend to think of, and we talk about it, you'll hear Americans talk about it a lot like this, British too. We have the money and we're investing in these countries. We're investing in them. We're giving money to these countries. Look at how much we're improving their quality of life by investing. Capital comes from us and goes to them. But that's not really what's happening here. Industrial capital, sure, maybe. The constant capital, yes. But that's only part of the whole thing. The other part is the variable capital and the surplus that is generated. It's still accurate today. If we want to talk about my go-to in recent years has been fast fashion, which is still fucking huge. Fast fashion is this horrifying sweatshop nightmare that exists in many parts of the world where Americans buy 500 shirts that will last one wearing or two wearings, and then they throw them out because they're the latest trend, but then they're out of style within a couple weeks because of TikTok or social media. Someone has to make these shirts and these clothes. There is a fixed constant capital to this. Cotton costs so much at the plantation. It's the way it works. Or linen or whatever you want to say, like the process of building it. So we don't do fast fashion here in the States for very good, expensive reasons. Instead, fast fashion is built elsewhere. And the amount of labor that is put in and the amount of variable capital that is expended and spent for that massive, massive dx dy ratio, that x plus dx, the filiative capital, the vampiric capital that needs new labor to survive, is genuinely unbelievable. The amount of money that you can make by using third world factories and third world setups, poor areas, places that don't have safety standards or any of those things, is astonishing. And we tend to think of, oh, well, we make money and we invest it elsewhere. But the reality is we have some money, but what's happening is their variable capital, the labor of these markets, is actually what is producing massive amounts of affiliative capital that is then brought back to the center. Completely different way of looking at it. So he mentions the use of territorialization and deterritorialization is going to be a thing that's coming sort of out and about. The big deal for Samir Amin, who was a Marxist, Egyptian Marxist economist, his setup and how he sort of played was talking about the analysis of the entire world as a large-scale system, an economic system. He didn't really subscribe to the idea that America's a system and Mexico's a system and that, you know, there's some trade between them. Instead, he really wanted to talk about this idea of global value chain, how production processes spread across multiple countries, how we disconnect production from local tradition or local parts. Again, thinking of, we go back to the way that they were talking about the Asiatic mode of production, or how Marx talked about it, where one group is the one who carves the marble, another village, their job is to haul it, another one, their job is to put it in place, and then the fourth group, they're artisans who carve it into whatever it needs to be in order to build the Great Wall, in order to build large-scale monuments, in order to build huge palaces, whatever it may be. We need specialization. Now, if we take that and we reduce it to almost every step of the way, it's kind of shocking how cheap we can get things. If you haven't been on Temu lately, it's worth going on Temu or Alibaba and seeing how cheap you can buy transistors, the basic pieces of electronics or toys or anything that is sort of part of the beginning of a supply chain. You're talking about pennies, if not less than pennies, fractions of a cent in order to have these things produced. And how that happens is not purely with constant capital. It's necessitating variable capital, which makes you realize how fucking little they're probably paying people in order to be able to have, these things going for 2 to 3 cents or 30 cents a piece, or by the hundred for two or $3. How much variable capital they're actually utilizing, how much labor is actually part of this setup. This is what happens. Capitalism exports affiliative capital, as they say. And this was Samir Amin's big push, is sort of talking through financial deterritorialization, the way that economic sovereignty is destroyed by these processes. The way culture becomes sort of flattened. If anyone has traveled in the world in the last 10 or 15 years, as an American, I've found it pretty depressing. I've been fortunate to be able to travel the world for work in various ways, but there are many areas of the world where it's not really that different. It's like you don't really get to visit foreign countries unless you really go out of the way. Most places kind of just feel like America Junior because culture does this. This has been a thing people have talked about for 60, 70, 80 years. This isn't new. It spawns a lot of backlash, but the culture breaks these rules too. We have a cultural deterritorialism happening with it. So this center periphery model, as we talk about it, came from Samir Amin. He's worth reading. It's really interesting shit. But it is, yes, Lily, it is kind of one big mall. And it's to the point where it's actually interesting to go visit malls in other countries because they're not as good at it. And it's really interesting to see the things they pick up on. It's kind of incredible. That is Samir Amin, highly recommended author in general. So that's where they kind of get this from. Our YouTube chat, Jordan asks, how they pay for shipping is beyond me. It's actually a really fascinating story I dug into because I was curious. I bought some electronics on Temu because I wanted to see and compare it to stuff I was buying on Mauser, which is, if you're if you're ever building electronics in the U.S., Mauser's where you buy stuff. We don't have Radio Shacks anymore. And found the same stuff on Temu. It actually was identical, which was freaked me out. But I was wondering how I bought it was like half a pound of electronics for like $16 shipped from China in like 3 days. And so what happened is, in order to make sure that there was a global mail system, there's actually a giant cabal called the Global Postal Service Foundation, something like that. A bunch of countries belong to, that subsidizes mail in countries that aren't as developed in order to make sure that they have mail systems. So you can send something to someone in, for example, Chad or Nairobi or other countries that don't have the infrastructure already built, and it won't cost you an arm and a leg. We subsidize that. So we, the developed countries, pay for that. China has been on the developed countries list since its inception, that this came about, and they fight every year to make sure they stay on it. That's it. So it's all government subsidies, as it always is. Got to support capital. We need those factories. We need those factories, or else we can't have our plastic stuff. Anyway. Yeah, so that's Samir Amin, and his stuff's pretty fantastic, to say the least. Big fan of Samir. Let's see. Top of 232 now. Excellent. Any questions on this? Any notes on this? Anyone, please? Got anything to say, Jack? Anything at all? Anything to add, Ben? Anyone?
I mean, I suppose I have some, I guess, some differences with it, but
Please.
I guess the one thing, I guess the one thing I'll add is like, so when they're talking about a center, how do you guys understand the word center? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a question for anyone.
Trying to avoid talking myself, so we can get other answers in before I answer. Lily says, place from where things flow and to where they are sucked back in.
What makes that a center rather than a circle, though? You know what I mean? Like when they say center, what is it we're talking about?
The center of
Or if it,
it's where financial capital resides.
but it resides in many places, right?
No.
You don't think so?
No. What we export is, so it has to do, or the way that they're talking about it. And let's see if we can maybe actually divine it from particularly the wording that they use. Because they're taking from specifically the way Samir wrote about it, but I want to see if they actually have. It would be a great error to think exports from the periphery originate primarily in traditional sectors or archaic territorialities. It's specifically impoverished, non-financialized sectors. It's not really geographical. It would be perhaps Wall Street, you might say, but even then, you're more talking about the concept of that at this point rather than literally like that street in the world. And again, I'm rambling for a second to say how I understand it. The reality is that you can have underdeveloped areas next door to these centers, and I'm putting that in quotes. So it's not so much center to periphery in terms of like a geographic area or even an economic area, but more literally where the transactions happen within capital, to where affiliative is the affiliative capital is exported or utilized in order to drive the largest profits. but go for it.
The affiliative capital is export, it moves, right? So if it moves, then we're talking about something that isn't purely localized, right? Right? Because, okay, I guess I ceased talking to myself. So where I'm coming from on this is like there's a way of looking at the center as something in which it's in the middle of, say, a circle. The kind of center I think that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about is it's kind of like what Derrida talks about, right? It's a kind of, it's not just a stability, right? It's a kind of concentration. So to the point on like places from which things flow to and where they are sucked back in, like the periphery and the center have to be understood with that same spirit, right? And where I'm driving at with this is this concept of movement. Because remember, we're talking about a limit that is, in a sense, defined by its ability to be displaced, to be changed, to be moved. There's a brief parenthetical. Pierre Moussa has succeeded, oops, Pierre Moussa has defined the United States as a fragment of the Third World that has succeeded and has preserved its immense zones of underdevelopment. Notice that the US in that sense is part of the Third World in that definition. That kind of centricity, right? I think the trick of this is understanding how something like the US can be Third World and central in that sense, right? Because this is a kind of centricity that for me is just like the periphery, you have to define them through the limit, right? So that you can understand what makes it central rather than peripheral. And I like the US example because they're talking about the US in terms of its own displacement, right? And in terms of its own sense of being peripheral and its own sense of being central, right? So that these kind of zones, where to follow Lily's point, right? Where you have things moving into and moving out of, right? These zones can function for the central as much as the peripheral, I think, because for exports and imports, right? It's a movement across and a movement back, right? And I think to that end, right, what we're talking about in that spirit is we're talking about how the flows themselves decode as they move that, code as they do that, but more generally, right, how the disjunction is functioning so that the movement itself, in terms of the breaks and the flows, or the emissions rather, are functioning in the spirit, right? So that you have affiliative capital as a question of movement, right? Because when we're talking about a rate of change, right, we can think of a curve and its inflection, right? We can think of these areas bubbling up as we have been, but we also have to see that as being alterable, right? And this is where your deterritorialization, this is where your displacement comes in, because that centricity is contingent on its displaceability, right? That peripherality is contingent on its displaceability, as with the US example. And that displaceability is this question of affiliative and alliant.
I'll agree with this. And it is mobile and it isn't determinate, but I would say that when we talk about the center, there's a reason we all are able to generally grasp that. Like the way Samir Amin talked about it. I pulled up some of his texts. Uh, the center holds monopoly on technology, financial control of markets, access to resources, media and communications, and weapons of mass destruction. These are the 5 things. And so for him, the power and control that is held by the center, and the center is a mobile place. It is, again, it's not specific, but it's this is really about ultimately dominance and power over those sort of global supply chains. The center has the power over those things.
Well, I get where you're coming from there. I think as I read Deleuze and Guattari, it's less a question of power over and it's more a question of deterritorialization, right? So like to that end, right? Like this point about primitive accumulation, if we're going to stick it in like to go the power over route, right? It's the relationship because the relationship constitutes both the center and the peripheral and its alterations. The United States, again, I like the example because the United States is a peripheral that has become center. And I think that's the interesting thing about it, right? Because, I mean, ultimately with rate of change, right, we are speaking in the spirit of change. So it's power in its malleability if you want to follow it that way.
Yeah, I can see this. I can see this.
Because I get where you're coming from. Like for Samir Amen, like he probably is going that way, right? Like he's probably concerned with, the global, what they call it, the geopolitics of it. And that made sense to me, right? But it's a geopolitics that's reliant on a deterritorialization and a kind of, as with the US, right, a kind of precariousness.
No, no, it's
Not,
it's certainly not. I don't want to say that he believes there's any stability in those countries. It's not. He doesn't believe the center of capital is a monolithic thing. He explicitly talks about how within it there's rivalries and competition and hatreds and all sorts of things. Like it's not that there's like this place of capital that like is utopia and everywhere else gets fucked. It's not Elysia. Like that's not the setup he's talking about. It's more that for him, and I would love to be dissuaded of this because I'm open to it, but the the economic, political, and technical power within a system is held by that center, and they talk about it that way. They speak of it again. It's a relationship, but there is power in that center that's hard for me to get away from as part of what he's discussing or what they're discussing here. Even if, and again, it's not that the United States as a whole is the center of power because the United States is a deeply underdeveloped country. There's millions of people in the US who don't have fucking sewage and have sewage running in their fucking yards. Like it's insane how shitty areas of this country really are. So it's not so much that, but it is the place that capital exists or the center of capital where things go in and out. I would still say it's like the US stock market and the people who are in control of such things. And I would probably still argue for that. And I'd,
yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from there,
because
but I
again,
want to make,
the other part of it is cultural, because it's the cultural export of domination as well is part of this. The exporting of American hegemony, even though we utilize, we're basically exporting affiliate capital. Capital's made elsewhere and then brought back via this process. We're talking about the cultural movement as well, which was a big part of Samir's work at large, is the idea of the cultural side of it also being part and parcel. That, I mean, he was Egyptian and it was in the 50s and 60s he was writing this. Like, you want to talk about a time that would be the time to be writing about this in Egypt, as they were normalizing relations with the US, as the basically what would become the Islamic Jihad movement being formed there. All of these things were part and parcel of his existence. And so it's well, we have the worldwide capitalist machine and the component of it, the center. It doesn't have to be a place, but it is a center and a concentration of it. And I can't help but have power as a part of that, at least as I consider it.
um, yeah, I get where you're coming from. Again, for me, like the power is in the relationship. And to that end, like the point I want to make here is the falling rate compensates through expansion, right? And I do mean that like not just in a Marxian sense, but in a Freudian sense there. The compensation is expansive, right? The periphery and the center are in part questions of expansion. And that's kind of the interesting thing to me there is that the export affiliative capital, right? The movement of it outward, if we want to stick with that kind of idea, right? The movement of it into the periphery. Insofar as it's deterritorializing, right? We're talking about the zones themselves altering. We're talking about the emissions themselves altering. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about it is, whether or not it's a question of domination and submission, it is going to be a question of how, in part, this expansion and this displacement are dancing here. Because with the U.S., right, like, and again, I keep going back to this, but the U.S. is a fragment of the third world that has succeeded and has preserved its immense zones of underdevelopment, right?
Mm-hmm.
To become a center containing your periphery. That the periphery, in this sense, is within the center, I think is a really interesting point. So that the exportation is within the zone itself, right? As much as it's constituted by, other countries and so forth.
No, I can get with this. I mean, so for me, one of the challenges where I'm at with this, just to sort of speak a little bit out of turn, is as we make our way through this, we kind of are able to see actually that the subjectivity and social production that is sort of created inside of each one of these socius, I don't want to say are mirrors of each other, but there is there is relationships in a very unique way under that of savagery, where it's non-economic, non-power driven. The consumption of desire happens right after the connective. Things are contingent. There's sort of that hyper survivalist thing. The subjectivity and the social order exist in that sort of same place. We see this within the despot as well. Non-economic power society, power and basically brutal power domination creates a despot that has control over all, and also then the subjectivity is that of the same thing. It's the enslaved mindset, that of the peasant, etc. Then capital, make our way to power, economic society. Got both of those as we sort of have this, brutal power dynamic, but the economic within it allows us to sort of step beyond a handful of things. Now, this play that they're making, as we make our way back into the machinic unconscious, we talk about the subject and how the subject, the quote unquote center of subjectivity, is traversing, it is moving, it is consuming and making its way through basically the co-partner to that would be that of the center of capital, or where capital is located or ostensibly located, which would basically mean a relationship where there is obviously power as a dynamic, generally speaking, but it doesn't necessarily have to be with the center of capital. The center of capital can be a more distributed relationship-based thing that is, again, contingent, but playing within the flux of deterritorialization, playing with these displaced limits, and basically, because we find capitalism playing more, schizophrenizing, as they say, more and more on the periphery versus the center being hardened, the center being a space of more of the political power that is being visited upon the subjects there. We see this odd play that's happening at the periphery. There is something happening there. I agree. I'm unable to verbalize it, though, I guess would be how I'd probably end that sentence and stop talking.
Well, I mean, that's what we're talking through, right? Like
Yes.
it's discovery, because the reason I'm going through this point, right, and what I want to drive the conversation toward is that sense of movement and change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the center itself, I mean, again, with the US, right, for the center to contain its periphery, to export within the center, right, it's almost like, it's like a kind of, I don't want to use the cage analogy because it might be misleading, but in the sense of
It's gonna
something
be
having a
misleading.
hole,
Don't do it. Don't do it.
yeah, it's like a donut, right?
Yeah.
There's a hole in the
Yeah.
center.
Yeah. Don't do it.
There
I
we go.
don't do it. Stay away from that one. That one
Yeah, I
goes,
know
that's a rabbit hole. That's bad.
I know it's gonna go into Lacan and all that shit, so
Mhm.
it's gonna get unwieldy quick. But that spirit, right, of the periphery being within the center, I think is interesting because what we're getting at, right, is a way in which we have two different perspectives relative to the limit. So, right, again, the center and the peripheral are constituted through the limit, and they change in relation to the
Well,
limit.
this is the shift also that's happening with the Erstadt that they talked about through that section, and already as we've gone over that, the way that the or maybe we haven't gotten there yet. God damn it! It doesn't matter. The state no
Oh, yeah,
longer
make your point.
is from above. The despot and the Erstadt is a transcendent unity that comes down upon the people within it. Within capital, it's actually imminent to the field of social forces themselves. So it actually no longer is the unity from above. So when we talk about the center of capitalism, it is easy for us to consider the state or the place of as being from above, but instead, because the power of the state is now vested socially and immediately and imminently within the social field, then it's actually experienced in every contingent interaction as such. So the power itself isn't necessarily centralized. Power is decentralized and being sort of handed out through the field itself, through the way that flux is being handled. So when we talk about the center, it's not so much the power structure maybe of the center, but instead the relationship between the center and the external, and each contingent relationship being seen at large as, oh, here's the center because of the millions and billions of transactions that happen, but instead that's actually a very relationship-based sort of after image that's being formed.
But the relationships are the key, right?
Yes.
Because to discuss power is to discuss it in terms of, in part the relationships, so like the connections, their disjunctions and so forth, that all constitute the group itself, to keep it simple, right? Because what I'm really driving at here is, again, this theme of the limit compensates its falling rate by its expansion. So, like, if we go with this at sporting sense, right, like we can think about Hawaii, right, where there's a movement of affiliative capital into Hawaii, and how that shapes the actual territory, how it is itself changing from the standpoint of a kind of, like, to go back to your point, a kind of sovereign nation into a colony, into a state. At that point, is Hawaii part of the center or the periphery? Becomes a question of when you're looking, right?
Yep.
Because it's changing. And that's part of my point, is the sense of the affiliative capital, right? Insofar as we're talking about deterritorialization and so forth, we are talking about things in their change. And the change relative to the limit, which is itself changeable, right? So any sense of power, right? So with Hawaii, they had a queen, right? The relationships of power are themselves necessarily malleable, altering, and contingent, such that even if you put it in terms of domination, submission, right, it is itself subject to change.
Constant change. Actually, it's not subject to change. It is change. It is the flux. Like this is the shift that is being made here, is the meaning from the despot coming down on high, saying what things are and that we have to figure out what they are and we have to ascertain it. Within capital, it is far more contingent, localized, and in flux.
Yeah, in which case we're talking about the decoding, the deterritorializing, right? Because it's also going to reterritorialize, which I don't want to say too much more on because it's going to take us out of this discussion. But to bring it back to the discussion, right? I mean, that's the central question: is how this movement alters itself, basically, and reconstitutes itself, right? So that the crises, the exportation, all of that, right? The exportation can create new centers, right? As with the Hawaii point.
Yes. Hawaii is actually a really fascinating one. It
It's a
really is.
underappreciated history, and I mean that in a rather grim sense.
Deeply so. And there's a lot of really weird shit that happens there because of the way that sort of Hawaii became its independent country under the Dole Corporation. And then the US made it a territory. And then, yeah, it's just fucking weird. Yeah.
A grim history, and a very recently grim history. So
Yes, very much.
we'll leave that to anyone who wants to see a rather dark side of recent history.
Yep. All right. Shall we get into some Maurice Clavel and make our way through? Is that where we're at? That's where we're at, right?
That sounds good to me.
All right. Good. The problem was raised again recently by Maurice Clavel in a series of decisive, again, I am so certain I've read all of this, in a decisive and willfully incompetent questions. That is, questions addressed to Marxist economists by someone who doesn't quite understand how one can maintain human surplus value as the basis for capitalist production, while recognizing that machines too work or produce value, that they have always worked, that they work more and more in proportion to man, who thus ceases to be a constituent part of the production process in order to become adjacent to this process. Hence, there is a machinic surplus value produced by constant capital, which develops along with automation and productivity, and which cannot be explained by factors that counteract the falling tendency, the increasing intensity of the exploitation of human labor, the diminution of the price of the elements of constant capital, etc. Since, on the contrary, these factors depend on it. It seems to us, with the same indispensable incompetence, that these problems can only be viewed under the conditions of the transformation of the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux. In defining pre-capitalist regimes by a surplus value of code, and capitalism by a generalized decoding that converted the surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux, we were presenting things in a summary fashion. We were still acting as though the matter were settled once and for all, at the dawn of a capitalism that had lost all code value. This is not the case, however. On the one hand, code continues to exist, even as an archaism, but they assume a function that is perfectly contemporary and adapted to the situation within personified capital, the capitalist, the worker, merchant, banker. But on the other hand, and more profoundly, every technical machine presupposes flux of a particular type, flux of code that are both interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. It is these fluxes of code that find themselves encasted, coded, or overcoded in the pre-capitalist societies in such a way that they never achieve any independence. The blacksmith, the astronomer. But the decoding of flux in capitalism has freed, deterritorialized, and decoded the flux of code just as it has the others, to such a degree that the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure as a field of forces, while depending on a science and technology, on a so-called intellectual labor distinct from the manual labor of the worker, the evolution of the technical object. In this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, that is constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes its technical modes of production. Where to start? God damn, there's just so much said in here. I want to dive into Clavel. I don't feel like doing that because there's just a lot of stuff in Clavel that's not great.
I mean, I don't know how much Clavel you need it right here, right?
I don't think
Because
you don't need much, but it does help a little bit because just maybe to mention like top line, what Clavel was doing is he was generally trying to sort of critique Marx by asking about the technical, the spiritual, the emotional, the human side. He was very he didn't like the idea of Marx's sort of hyper-determinist economic style as he saw it. And so for Marx, like, for example, alienation was purely an economic thing, even though it existed elsewhere. Clavel didn't think so. He wanted it to be about cultural or existential, spiritual alienation, and spent his time critiquing that way. So he's kind of pushing it in that direction because, yeah, that was kind of what he did as a thing.
okay. I mean, to me, it's like one of the classic things you get in Marx and like Marxian studies, right? Is a humanist reading, right? Like, I mean, I hope this isn't a contentious point, right? Like, there are groups that are explicitly humanist Marxists, right? Um, and they're taking on the problem of fetishism, right? In part. So, like, remember for Deleuze and Guattari, their view on humanism relative to AO, right? Relative to what we're reading, their view on humanism is that it functions as a kind of black humor, right? So as we're talking about like human surplus value here and everything, right? Like for them, this is a kind of black humor, um,
It
which I
is.
would assume is their application to Clavel
Yes.
without knowing much about them.
No, that's what they're doing 100%. I'm agreeing with you.
Okay. I think I said I don't know, but
You don't have to. Clavel, like, again, you're probably right in that it's not as important. The thing is, the footnote here that they have 76 for the end note, which is the reference to Clavel. The line is, Marxist economy. These questions were addressed to Marxist economists by someone who doesn't quite understand how one can maintain human surplus value as a basis for capitalist production, while recognizing that machines to work or produce value, they've always worked, and that they work more and more in proportion to man, who thus ceases to be a constituent part of the production process in order to become adjacent to this process. This was Clavel's core argument: is that human labor isn't really center to it. Machines can be center to it. They work just like people do, and
yeah. So I mean, let's take it in terms of like fetishism, right? Like for Marx, it's the labor value that leaves people and animates commodities, right? Animates production and so on and so forth, right?
Mhm.
For Deleuze and Guattari, it's more of a question of how the disjunction is changing, right? So like the context of their question is not that kind of fetishism. It is a question of how the disjunction has shifted in such a way that capital begets capital, right? As opposed to the earth begetting itself, right? Not to go too naturalistic, but or the empire begetting itself.
Yeah, I mean, what they're doing here is just expanding on affiliative capital and discussing it sort of as its place exists and continuing the same argument. Like, they're making the move as they're talking about sort of the shift between the code and the decoding and recoding that happens, or the overcoding that happens within the despotic. They're talking about sort of the way that all of this gets decoded. All the codes become sort of while they're around, there's decoding, recoding, there's an axiomatization that begins playing. We're starting to see the beginning of their play towards how axiomatization functions within the capitalist socius. Like that's kind of where we're at, I think I would say.
Yeah, but I liked your emphasis on like the relationship, right? So it's the recoding and the decoding
Hmm.
relationships here. And I think that is, I mean, to quote Shakespeare, that is the question.
So how do we expand on that? I mean, they're about to actually go really deep into it. So should we maybe hold off explaining or going too deep until we do that? Probably a good idea.
Let's make one more point relative to like the whole fetishism thing.
Okay.
So this is the grace into what we just read. Capitalism schizophrenizes more and more on the periphery, right? So again, that movement on the periphery is also important, just like the center. It will be said that even so, at the center of the falling tendency retains its restricted sense, i.e., the relative diminution of surplus value in relation to total capital. So the relationship, the ratio between surplus value decreasing in relation to total capital, right? The aggregate, so to speak. A diminution that is ensured by the development of productivity, automation, and constant capital. So affiliative capital at the end there, right? So that's the point, right? Is this falling rate of tendency and its compensation to, I'm sorry, the tendency of the falling rate of profit and its compensation by expansion, right? Again, the displacement is worked through the affiliative exportation and movement, right? Which carries with it an alliant movement, right? So, without going too deep into this paragraph, then, on one hand, code continues to exist even as an archaism, but they assume a function that is perfectly contemporary and adapted to the situation within the personified capital, right? And this is where capital, like, appears to be like people, right? So we're talking about like global persons, right? We're talking about the
Yes.
first synthesis. Um, But on the other hand, and more profoundly, every technical machine presupposes flows of a particular type. So, in this sense, right, so on one hand, we have like global persons in this general discussion of like um, what I think is going to be your affiliative capital. And then on the other hand, every technical machine presupposes flows of particular type, flows of code that are both interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. So very generally, right, the codification we've been talking about in the previous two socii is still at play for any global person, right? Is still at play for any machine. It is these
Yes.
flows of code. It is these flows of code that find themselves encastic coded or overcoded pre-capitalist societies in such a way they never achieve any independence. The blacksmith, the astronomer. But the decoding of flows in capital has freed, deterritorialized, and decoded the flows of code just as it has the others, to such a degree that the atomic machine has always increasingly internalized them in the body or its structure as a field of forces. God, this is like the longest sentence ever. Well, depending on the science and the technology, on a so-called intellectual labor distinct from the manual labor of the worker. Okay, so in this sense, they're just talking about how like machines now do kind of the intellectual labor. The point is, though, I think they're putting the two in relationship because in this sense, right, something's changed where decodification allows for it's not a true sense of autonomy, and it's a sense of autonomy relative to the way they talked about the semi-autonomous before, right? It's an autonomy that's going to be more relative to the zones we're talking about, uh, where the socius is altered. So it's not the departure of the despot,
Well,
it's
there's a second bit
something more
here
local.
there
Go ahead.
because this is really part one of a couple parts. Again, in the French, this is not a break in a paragraph. I hate when they do this, but they're talking again because they're talking about the process. They're talking about relationships. when we're talking about the decoding, and they are saying here very explicitly, it's like the decoding of flows in capitalism has freed, deterritorialized, and decoded the flows of code just as it has the others to such a degree, the blah, blah, blah. Like there's this huge amount of decoding that's happening. They haven't talked about recoding yet because that's the next bit, because it's not just that things become decoded. It's things do, but it's not only that. There's another step. And so we have to make that, we kind of have to have that step pushed into here. And we're going to see it come back because this is where we see and notice the implications of what is the Urstadt, the state, the place of power within these things. Because again, codes aren't destroyed. They're allowed to exist as archaisms. They talk about this very explicitly in the last paragraph. So how does that happen if capital comes along, decodes? So what happens next? Well, it's not that capital recodes, it's the state recodes. And so there's these other steps that are happening along with this that make the capitalist machine as a whole operate. And this is where I think the center of what, and to go back to the discussion we were having earlier, the center of capitalist, the socialists as a whole, it does have a power component with it. Not implicit within capital, but it is this sort of state apparatus. It's the recoding of the decoding. It's the sort of coercion of meaning back into being sort of this element. Because we have, as they talked about, and again, we're going to be going back over, but these breaks, these skizzes, these flows, this decoding that happens at the periphery have to be overwritten. And we have to have this sort of secondary thing happen within these things in order to, basically reconstitute stability and power. And so there's this other part that's happening that they haven't gotten to yet, because this paragraph is basically about decoding and the flows of code and how capital utilizes those and decodes those at the peripheral. And then we find the recoding happening in the next paragraph.
I'll save my remarks and recoding for them then.
Yeah, because it is part of the process. I just want to make sure like people aren't like, oh, so cool, and then we're done for the day, because we're not. There's a lot more to this. It's just the first step. Right.
So then to bring us into the next paragraph, right? So then where this ends up, right, and is in this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism. So in this sense, it's not machines taking on labor capacity, labor power that makes capital, right? Which is one way of understanding like a kind of fetishism, right? But capitalism that creates machines. So what machines do, whether through code or decode, right, is one and the same question by way of capital, right? Because with capitalism, we're just talking about, the external limit that, as deleuze and guattari say, is kind of a vanishing limit anyways. But in that sense, right, what they're really saying is the machines are a question of the socius, right, or of production more generally, but the social body, we would say here.
Well, it's what's important is the way that Marx talked about specifically how capital makes its move, because Marx talked about the two steps, and these are the two steps they're using. It's again, third volume of Capital, the one no one reads. The two moments of capital work, where on the one side we have the new productive capital stock that transforms apparatuses of production and consumption. To quote Holland, this continual revolution of the means of production that for Marx characterizes capitalism deterritorializes existing labor and capital in order to devote them to new forms of production and consumption. And in this process, it spawns decoding throughout society. So decoding as labor and production are all freed towards this new form of production. But in a second moment, this progressive movement is abruptly stopped and everything becomes reterritorialized. The evolving apparatuses of production and consumption are tied down to what is now obsolete capital stock, solely in order to valorize it and realize profit on a previous investment. This move that capital makes by having the affiliative stock, again, dy over dx, ends up at, again, because the variable capital, the affiliative capital, affiliative stock, this is where we kind of find the driving engine, the workers, blah, 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 Marx, everything, right? But that extra energy has to be crushed down back into the constant capital. It has to be in order for us to have a singular currency that people can realize value from. You cannot have previous investment that doesn't have a return on it. You can't just invest and then, oh, look, it just explodes out. How wonderful. That we have to be able to bring it back to investment that I'm then able to have as constant capital that I then invest elsewhere. And so that recrushing of things, these two steps, is what they're going to be getting into right now, with the first step of the decoding, where the or deterritorialization, the breaking of codes that capital does, followed by the repatriation of everything back to constant capital, to obsolete capital stock, the dead capital, no longer alive, that's off like vampires to go look for new affiliative stock to feed off of in order to further build its own setup. And so this is the as Holland puts it, the yoking of relations of production and consumption to the dead weight of private surplus appropriation. And this is the third step of, this is the third book at Capital. This is where they're making the move. I'm going to get to the next paragraph where we actually literally talk about this, and then we'll revisit Jack. But several correctives must be introduced in this regard. These breaks and cleavages take time, and their extension is very wide-ranging. By no means does this diachronic capitalist machine allow itself to be revolutionized by one or more of its synchronous technical machines, and by no means does it confer on its scientists and its technicians an independence that was unknown in previous regimes. Doubtless it can let a certain number of scientists, mathematicians, for example, schizophrenize in the corner, and it can allow the passage of socially decoded flux of code that these scientists organize into axiomatics of research that is said to be basic. But the true axiomatic is elsewhere. And they have in parentheses, leave the scientists alone to a certain point. Let them create their own axiomatic. But when the time comes for serious things, for example, non-determinist physics with its corpuscular flows must be brought back into line with determinism. The true axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, which takes the place of the old codings and organizes all the decoded flux, including the flux of scientific and technical code, for the benefit of the capitalist system and in the service of its ends. That's why it has often been remarked that the Industrial Revolution combined an elevated rate of technical progress with the maintenance of a great quantity of obsolescent equipment, along with a great suspicion concerning machines and science. An innovation is adopted only from the perspective of the rate of profit its investment will offer by lowering of production costs. Without this prospect, the capitalist will keep the existing equipment and stand ready to make a parallel investment in equipment in another area. It's a fact of business. I mean, just as a thing, flatly. Just flatly, that's the way that goes. But this is the move that Marx was talking about. This second step. We have, and we can have a lot of ways that capitalists, we can expend money and let people in the corners do their thing. But at some point, it must be brought to heel. It must be brought to bear in service of capital and in place of capital. But specifically because the system of capital necessitates the dollar being the singular currency. And this currency being that thing that all has to come back to. They had the quote from Susan Brunoff 2 paragraphs ago. The very notion of a monetary mass can have a meaning only relative to the workings of a system of credit, where the different kinds of money combine. Without such a system, one would have only a sum of means of payment that would have no access to the social nature of the general equipment, and that could serve only in local private circuits. There'd be no general monetary circulation. Only in the centralized system can the different kinds of money become homogeneous and appear as the components of an articulated whole. This is the objective dissimulation in the system that we're now starting to talk about. This is the correctives that are being introduced. as they speak about it. It's why often been remarked that the Industrial Revolution had this huge technical process, along with the maintenance of obsolescent equipment, along with the suspicion of machines and science. Because machines aren't made simply because they do the job better or because of X, Y, and Z, but they're done in service specifically. Will they be useful for constant capital in order to increase or decrease, to change the value of variable capital, labor? That's it. Without that, there's no interest. And they'll simply allow their entire industry to stagnate because there's no profit in it. They just won't. They'll invest elsewhere into another part of things. That's why you see, it's why you see a lot of Amazon's investments who are deeply vertically integrated as a company into really weird corners of things where they're trying to cut costs in ways that people are clocking in, because you're talking about pennies of a moment, but every penny counts when you're at a certain size. So they'll invest in there, but they won't improve X, Y, and Z because it just doesn't generate that variability or constant capital. There you go, Jack. Does that help?
Help with.
I don't know what you were talking about. I thought it might. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I'm wrong.
Um, let's talk about reproduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the falling rate of profit, right? So, like in terms of production costs, right? Does increasing production cost come with more barriers to exporting affiliate of capital or less?
Say that one more time.
Does increasing production costs come with more barriers to pushing out industrial affiliate of capital or less?
That's not. It isn't determined by that specifically. You may have,
Yeah,
you can have increased constant capital investments that drastically reduce the affiliative capital need or change the relationship for affiliative capital in a handful of inputs, which can overall increase profitability. Conversely, you can have a constant capital that drops suddenly, but if McDonald's is suddenly not having to pay a ton for pork, that may not be because they've changed pork, but because the pork supplier had changed their methods and changed their setup. So there's a lot of things that sort of can change that. Again, it's more about the relationship than any direction.
right. And so if production cost increases, right, you have to concentrate more. I believe it's affiliative at this point. More affiliative capital into that because it's constant, right? So, so, and in this sense, I want to step back from the moguls at the table. If capital finds that it's concentrating more affiliative capital into certain production, right, as opposed to other forms of production, right, then we have the sense going back to the falling rate of profit, right? You could call it an economy of this scale, but I'm less interested in that sense of it. I'm more interested in that the concentration itself poses its own challenge, right? And that's, to me, that's one of the interesting things there, because to this sense of an innovation is adopted only from the perspective of the rate of profit its investment will offer by lowering production costs, right? If production costs lower, affiliative capital can move across more liquid, so to speak, can go into different places, right? It can diversify, if you want to use a finance term,
Well,
without this prospect.
but it comes back to human surplus value being the center of it still, like the thing that matters.
Well, that's what a humanist reading of Marx would say, right? Is that it's a question of human surplus value, right? The
Yes.
curious thing is that um, it's a question of machines, right?
No.
Question of machines.
How?
The true axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, which takes the place of the old codings and organizes all the decoding flows, including the flows of scientific and technical code, For the benefit of the capitalist system and in the service of its ends.
Yes.
What a time to be alive.
The social machine is the state, though.
The social machine is machines at large, I think.
No.
Social machines are desiring machines, though. Just
The
under
social
conditions
machines
of
are
production.
desiring machines under determinate conditions, and
Right.
specifically the state in the capitalist system is imminent to the social itself. So in this case, the axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, the social machine being capitalism and the state, which takes the place of the old codings, organizes the decoded flux, including that of scientific and technical code for the benefit of the capitalist system in the service of its ends. This is why it has been remarked the revolution, the Industrial Revolution, had a huge amount of technical progress, but a massive amount of obsolescent equipment, because you end up in this really weird place where it's not worth upgrading things because, while they made huge leaps forward, they actually didn't make the leaps forward they could have. There's millions of ways to do a better mousetrap, but it may cost a little bit more, or it may not deliver the rate of profit exchange that you really want. And the social machine is what determines this. Like, the social machine is what says this machine is worth building, this machine is not. A machine doesn't just get built for fun. Machines aren't in power like actual machines. Social machines are. The social machines and the sort of axiomatic of the social machine that says this.
I don't think that's the state, though.
It is the state. Well, the state's a part of it.
Well, are you talking about the Erstat here?
Yes.
Then we're talking about overcoding, aren't we?
No. No, the
I
Erstat,
think
the Erstat doesn't
we are.
overcode in capitalism. It recodes.
Yeah, largely through overcoding, right? I mean,
Mm,
I don't deny there's some question of codification there.
no, because it wouldn't be overcoding because capitalism necessarily decodes. Decoded flux are then recoded. You can't overcode something that's not coded.
I would want to go back a few paragraphs to double check. I remember the Erstat coming up. For some reason, I'm thinking in terms of overcoding, but
Well, no, it was
it does
overcoding
speak
in
to
the it
capital.
was overcoding in the despotic. That's what happened because the edict would come from on high. Necessarily, his code would overwrite, but you would keep the other code underneath the way they talked about it, like written over manuscripts. So you would overcode, but that was under the despotic. This is not capital. Capital displaces the Erstat into imminent social production and
Right.
changes our relationship directly to it.
Right, but the question is, does it code or overcode or do both? And I suspect it's both. But
Interesting. I only understand it as recoding, but hey, we'll get there.
well, but recoding has to be a question of coding and overcoding.
It does.
I think so, right? Or at least, I mean, because recoding is a process of codification, and there's still the issue of overcodification, which is the one I mean, that's where I'd want to double check
Sure.
because I could be misremembering there too.
That's a question about
You're very quiet. I can barely hear you.
question about the
There
when
you
he
are.
talks about the machines, automated machines taking over, replacing labor.
Yes.
Uh, what was his point there? That it eventually will replace all labor, or you have no more surplus labor, or no need for surplus labor, or what was that? Oh, I didn't quite understand the point he was making there.
Yeah. Let's take it. So, let me see. I want to make sure. One sec. I want to make sure we're getting the right sentence. Where did you read this?
What's the previous paragraph? You're talking about the last half of the previous paragraph, JK?
Yeah, when he's talking about the automated machines replacing surplus labor, and so we would get the surplus value out of the automated machines instead of the labor. So what happens to the exploitation of labor then? Exploitation of human labor. What happens is that just human labor is just replaced by automated machine.
So,
Uh,
so this is, I think he's saying something a little bit more complex here, because he's talking about because again, this comes from Clavel and what Clavel was talking about. If we talk about, um, and it's kind of, I'm trying to figure out how to parse a bunch of different things. Constant capital as a thing. I pay for stuff that goes in the factory before people come in. All the stuff that goes in, that setup can actually. At one point, there was nothing. It'd be like, hey, I need people to come in. People are going to do every part of the thing. As I replace those and the factory becomes more and more automated, there is some level where constant capital will end up having some machinic surplus value that is produced. As he says here, this develops along with automation and productivity and cannot be explained by factors that counteract the following tendency: increasing of intensity of exploitation, blah, 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 because these factors depend on it. As they say though, so on the one hand, this is what they're talking about is how over time machines, we get, at some point we have the fantasy being sold by tech bros today that we're going to have robots in all of our factories and we won't have people working in factories anymore. As tech bros selling the same fucking dream that we've been lied to for the last 100. But this thing is what he's talking about. Now they respond, on the contrary, it seems to us with the same indispensable incompetence. These problems can only be viewed under the conditions of the transformation of surplus value of code into surplus value of flux. In defining pre-capitalist regimes by the surplus value of code, capitalism by a general decoding that converted the surplus value of code into flux, we were presenting things summary. We were still acting as though the matter were settled at the dawn of a capitalism that lost all code. But that's not the case. Code continues to exist, even as an archaism, but they assume a function. The code assumes a function that's contemporary and adapted to a situation within personified capital. You become a capitalist, a worker, a merchant, a banker. On the other hand, every technical machine presupposes flux of a particular type, interior and exterior to it, a flux of code that are forming the elements of a technology and even a science. If you think, I mean, we might be able to actually say it almost quite literally in terms of how AI is working right now, where we have flux of code to at least some level. These are encasted, coded, overcoded in pre-capitalist societies where they never have independence. There's the blacksmith. The blacksmith does this thing, but decoding of things in capitalism frees them. It frees, deterritorializes, decodes flows of code like everything else to a degree that the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure of forces while depending on science and technology and so-called intellectual labor distinct from the manual labor of the worker. So he's saying something far more complex than just, oh, we're going to have excess. It's actually what we need to talk about is the codes of old actually moving into machines. We need to not consider machines as separate from us. This is a thing that they've been talking about, I think, since the beginning of the book, and also Deleuze's other writings. If we consider machines as separate from us, then it's like, oh, we are using machines, great. But maybe more what's happening here is that the code of old and the overcoding of old, we're finding broken apart, and parts of that, the code, parts of the actual code of existence that are being broken apart are ending up in the machines, and the machines are taking them on. The machines are part of all of this as well. So as he says, in this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes its technical means of production, modes of production. This is one of the plays they're making when we talk about the construction machines. We aren't separate from them. Capitalism isn't separate from them. Our social existence isn't separate from these machines. Machines are built, they're taking on tasks and elements and code, and they're doing some of these things. Like they're doing some of the stuff that once upon a time would be the blacksmith or the astronomer, well, we no longer have sort of the astronomer as a thing. We actually have scientists who review data, and we have people construct data, but we have machines that do that. So the codes are being broken apart and distributed across machines as well. That's the line they have here. Every technical machine presupposes, I'll just use the words as is, flows of a particular type. Flows of code that are both interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. So when we have an astronomer with a telescope, like there's a lot of things happening. You have to do think about all of the different parts that make an astronomer and a telescope a thing that does the thing that astronomers do. Now take a bunch of those parts and decode them and then push multiple parts of those into computers, high-tech radiological imaging, deep space telescopes, automated systems that do all that. Then what does an astronomer do? Well, it's not the same fucking job that it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But it's the flux of code, the way code means, what a blacksmith does is distributed. So it's not just that the blacksmith now has other tools at his disposal. That's representationally thinking through this. It's human labor that is part of the same machine that a blacksmith had, a factory that made forks. The way that a factory that made forks would have existed over the last 400 years, in goes metal, out comes forks. But inside of that, there's a bunch of shit going on and changing. Different machines, different people doing different things. But overall, it's the same kind of shit happening there. Same flux, same code, same changes, same blah, blah, blah. But what goes in and out, that doesn't really shift very much. It's maybe fewer people, but the machines now take on those work, but the stuff inside is the same. So there's this thing that's happening where capitalism is seeing all of this. Capitalism does all this and is building these machines. Capitalism creates the machines necessarily because the machines are created directly in line with the necessity for the variable capital of human labor and the profit margin at the end. To say another way, I would not get investment if I wanted to build a factory that didn't give a shit about those things at all. I have to care about those things. They're what determine what machines I put in there. If I just put a bunch of computers and random maker stuff, you can see those. They're generally community owned. They exist, maker spaces. But they don't have a specific in and out. They don't do this for profit, like as a thing. That's not how it works. It's inside the codes aren't industrial, but the industrial places are. They are. So the codes aren't human. They aren't stuck within human. Machines are part of this. They're technical. This is. I mean, to me, this is Simondon. That's where I would go with this. This is Simondon's technical machines, and I wish I had my Simondon guys in this fucking reading with me. But that's part of what they're talking about here. It's the movement and the shift of how code of old, it's being displaced, it's being broken apart. So there isn't really a blacksmith, but now there's the blacksmith, and it's actually a big giant CNC machine that does forging and everything automatic with a guy who hits a few buttons. So what is the code that's happened? Well, code has been displaced and changed. To such a degree, the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure as a field of forces, while depending on a science and a technology, on so-called intellectual labor distinct from manual labor of the worker. This is the evolution of the technical object. In this sense, it is not machines that create capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines. Now, they want to take a second because they go, well, first off, these breaks and cleavages, these shatterings that happen, what Marx talked about with these revolutions of industrial sort of technical movement where suddenly there's new machines, these take time. Their expansion is wide-ranging, and it really is. I could give examples of the way that printing works, or the way that vacuum sealing or vacuum packaging works, and how, forming clay pots and the technology behind that, suddenly everyone does things the same way everywhere. This shatters and breaks apart, again, the codes, but the codes don't disappear. There's still stuff happening. It goes elsewhere. And this is what they're talking about. They're like, we can allow scientists to be on the other side of things. Oh, good. You guys have fun in the corner there. That doesn't matter. But eventually we need to bring it back. You need to bring it back to this goal-based, profit-based, very determinate system where everything gets to be recoded in place directly, because we have variable capital with constant capital that needs to produce a profit. Money needs to make money. And ultimately, this is why they're talking about the Industrial Revolution combined a rate of elevated technical process with a maintenance of obsolete equipment, with a great suspicion. Innovation is adopted only from the perspective of rate of profit its investment will offer by lowering of production costs. Without this, the capitalist will keep the current equipment to stand ready to make a parallel investment in equipment in another area. That's it. That's it. That's how that sets up. Does that make sense, JK?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So when they talk about the capital as a body, is it like they're talking about capitalism as a kind of a body without organs? It's maybe an extension of that machine, and that it just like the body without organs operates based on axiomatics, just like
So-
Spinoza describes, right? But capitalism also operates by axiomatics.
So they're very particular when they talk about this. They do mean the full body. When they say body, they don't mean that of the body without organs. When they say the body of capital, the body of the blacksmith, the body of the capitalist, they're very particular with their uses. So no, they really aren't trying to get us to think about this as the BWO or anything like that. These things play into the BWO and its construction and how the subject works within the, unconscious, but this is not, we don't have like 6 BWOs that are competing, kind of. It's not that kind of thing.
It's the socios, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, if you want to put it in tandem with the BWO, it's the socios to social production, as the BWO is the body to desiring production, right?
It's very machinic, just like the BWO is very machinic, right? It's it's like an extension. I think of it as like an extension of the
So if
BWO.
the BWO
It's
is
very
on,
machinic. It goes from the earth. Thinking of the ourselves as the body as the earth, or as a despotic, and then we have capitalism, which is the machinic. form
Yeah.
of,
Ben, you've got an answer, I think.
well, I was going to say, like, when we look at the BWO, we're looking sort of at, like, the molecular level of things. When we're looking at the socius or capital, in this case, as we're using it here, we're looking at things kind of on the molecular level, on
Molar.
molar level, rather. Yeah, sorry. And
Cool.
you're right to draw this relation. They describe the body without organs as the residuum of a deterritorialized socius.
Yeah, it's two regimes, right? Two regimes of production.
Yeah, you're saying the BWO is one regime and the capitalism is another regime of production.
Capital is socius, but yes.
Yeah, okay. But
So-
does the BWO also, function by way of in interaction with associates?
No.
No, is it molar and molecular? Don't they go together?
The desiring machines interact and invest directly. The BWO doesn't produce and doesn't give a shit.
Well,
What, Jack?
there's like we're jumping ahead, which is going to make this tough, because you need the absolute limit here, right?
Well,
You need to-
you're right. So I'm going to actually stop this convo before we continue, because we're going to go down a really bad rabbit hole. Let me try to rephrase it. Let me
let's
just
just say
go for it.
there's a relationship between the two.
There is
Right.
a relationship. How I'd put it is, right now, what we're doing inside of this section particularly, and it's the reason that they've titled this section what they did, which is the civilized capitalist machine, is we're talking through how the socius functions. And they're going to be going through all of those pieces. Then we're going to be getting to the next section, which is capitalist representation, which is how the internal desire, your desire, or the depersonalized pre-conscious desire that exists, that of desiring machines and that produced, there we're going to see how these things begin to interact. And so I would almost say, like, for now, this is sort of more of a economics and social lesson overall. We're not quite getting back to how desire is really falling into that. Instead, it's talking through a handful of functions because we're going to be cross-marrying them very, very soon here. If that makes sense. Like right now, it's literally about labor and the social machine and its operants, and we're like 4 or 5 pages away from making the switch. So I kind of want to hold for now because we're going to be referring back to this when we get there. Because when we're talking about the socius, we're talking about the BWO, we're talking about how desiring machines and desiring production is malfunctioning within representation. We're going to be referring back to this section, but this section isn't going to answer that. Is that a fair way to put it, Jack?
Um, I mean, to discuss the relationship, we just need a little bit more because it changes so drastically. Like we can answer your question, but it's going to take us way outside this
It's
paragraph.
going to take us forever outside the paragraph. Maybe later this week when I do my AO open house, I'll try to do it during the day, JK, and we'll see if we can spend some time on that. Because it is a really great, interesting question. It's just, I'm nervous about spending the next 2 hours answering it. Sorry. Is that okay? I don't know. It's probably an unsatisfying answer, though.
Well, also, I mean, we're basically at time, so like
We are at time. With that,
maybe to
go ahead, finish us off, and we'll get out of here.
yeah, maybe to pull this back, right? So I mean, the question is one of production, right? So like the question of human or machine and all that, right? That you can go back through the personified capital versus the whole, the question of the social machine there. Looking in this paragraph we're closing off on, right? Like, when they're talking about the autonomy, right? Like this is where in the despotic you have overcoding providing semi-autonomy, right? Whereas decoding provides a new form of autonomy altogether for capital, right? So like the interesting thing to me is like when they're talking about the axiomatic, right? So so braits and cleavages, right? So they're just talking about the first synthesis. Their extension is very wide ranging. By no means does the diachronic capitalist machine allow itself to be revolutionized by one or more of its chronous technical machines. And by no means does it confer on its scientists and its technicians an independence that was unknown in the previous regimes, meaning socii, right? Or, well, perhaps socii, but anyways, more generally, right, it's those same two parts, the personified capital and the technical machine more generally, right, as this question of decodification and recodification. With capital, we get this point of the axiomatic, right? So we're talking about limits of production very generally, right? Doubtless it can be, doubtless it can let a certain number of scientists, mathematicians, for example, so air quotes, schizophrenize in their corner. So, right, the global persons won't schizophrenize in their corner. And I'm sorry, doubtless it can. So that is a possibility. And it can allow the passage of socially decoded flows of code that these scientists organize into axiomatics of research that is said to be basic. So what they're saying is, yeah, in a sense, global persons can schizophrenize, right? Can create a kind of decodification, so to speak. Um, and yes, the socius can allow the passage of socially decoded flows that those scientists use, right? into the axiomatic of research. The more interesting thing they say is that's not the true axiomatic, right? The true axiomatic is elsewhere. And they have this little parenthetical about what that means in terms of bringing it together. The true axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, which takes the place of the old codings and organizes all the decoding flows, including the flows of scientific and technical code. So we're talking about a social machine that organizes all codings, that acts the way a code did and organizes decoded flows, right? So two parts of an axiomatic there, right? It functions the way a code used to function, and it organizes decoded flows. For the benefit of the for the benefit of the capitalist system and the service of its ends, right? So I mean, an axiomatic here, right? There's like three parts to this definition, but generally speaking, right, we can kind of bring it in relationship to the falling rate of profit, which is more generally speaking a question of the limit and its displacement. It's a question of how codes function from the sense of the machine, right? So like the WASP has its code. It's kind of the spirit of what we're talking about here, the machine itself, and a way in which that machine participates in organizing decoded flows, right? So if we're putting this in synthesis one, right, we have a machine here seeming to function as a kind of code, right? Uh, insofar as it functions as a kind of code, it works with the decoded emissions and rates to organize them, right? And it organizes them relative to the limit and its displacement. And that's putting in very much, I think, in first synthesis terms. But first synthesis functioning, since it's axiomatic, right, there's a disjunctive connotation there. That's where I'm leaving it for the day.
That's fair. It's the push, and we're going to be coming back around to it. The next, just not as a preview, but the next sentence that we're going to be reading is thus the importance of human surplus value remains decisive even at the center and in highly industrialized sectors. The push at its base is how important variable capital is to this process for us to have that last bit, to have basically the push, the reason why things are done. And you have this really interesting sort of play where, and then again, as they're talking about machines replacing, you have a really odd sort of interaction when it comes to how these things work. Car companies have a very particular way that this happens. It's one that I happen to know, family from Detroit. So you kind of learn about the car stuff and all that. But basically you end up with like the constant capital is like the tools and stuff in order to build. And then you have some level of wages and you end up with profit at the end of that. Profit being unrealized wage payouts, because you just basically, hey, look, a person created X amount of value. We're going to give them 30% of that. You have some level of profit. When you automate, you actually have significantly fewer workers with an advanced machinery. So you have this really odd thing that happens, though, where the machinery is far more expensive. And even though you have overall the same wages, because you have, higher paid people that are done, you end up with, well, absolute profit may be more. Your actual rate of profit sort of falls. Tech companies run into this all the time. Agriculture is being hit by it right now. There's this really odd sort of play as these things go on. So this is what they want us to keep focus on. For now, I'm going to pull the plug on this convo because we can literally go on for forever. But I want to say thank all of you for joining who have. Next week, we'll be continuing from here. I'll be watching later in the week for the open house or larger Anti-Oedipus discussion to sort of go through it. And otherwise, I will see you all next